Welcome back, everyone. Well, it's time for a BFSI exclusive, if I may say that. And this particular panel discussion actually talks about the fact that if the banks are actually ready for the requirement or the regulation for AI in banking, it's a new frontier that we're looking at. So let's gather all the answers from our set of amazing speakers joining us in just a couple of seconds. In fact, let me go ahead and also introduce our speakers for all of you. Spearheading this panel discussion for us all, we have with us Sindhu Bhaskaran, Principal Director, Intelligent Automation and Artificial Intelligence Solutions, Accenture. In fact, she's an innovator at heart and a thought leader with more than 24 years of experience. She's also worked with customers across domains in banking, telecom, manufacturing, as well as retail, and enabled digital and innovation-led differentiation and business value. Well, joining her, we also have with us Shivani Venkatesh, Head Insights, Analytics, and AI with RBL Bank Limited. And she's someone who's responsible for implementing and managing the bank-wide data governance framework and platform. We also have with us Jayashree Mitra, who is the Head Technology and User Services, Asia Pacific, and Head Transformation, UBS. She's a seasoned technology professional with over 22 years of experience in diverse fields such as FMCG and banking technology in various functions such as operations and marketing. And that also leaves me with our final panelist joining in. We have with us Mr. Rajesh Chopra, Senior Vice President and Head Data and Services COE, Mastercard. He comes with more than 2 decades of experience across diverse areas like business analytics, risk management, BFSI consulting, re-engineering, and technology. So on that note, it looks like we managed to sort of space a very, very pertinent topic for us all. And it's time to bring on board our set of panelists to share their insights with you all. So stay with us. Our panelists will join you in just a couple of seconds.
Good afternoon, all. Welcome to this panel discussion. The key topic for today, and with my power-packed panel here, is regulation for AI in banking, a new frontier. Are banks ready for this requirement? Increasingly, we are seeing that the BFSI sector and banking in particular is moving from the traditional banking channels to digital channels. And with increased adoption of digital and we see the increased ingestion of AI and data into the services provided by banks. So of course, that means that there is a lot of benefits which come with this. And the pandemic has only increased this AI adoption. A latest survey by Accenture shows that 84% of the top 1,500 CXOs consider AI to be critical for their future prospects. So I would like to start with Jayashree Mitra and probably start the conversation with asking, what are the top 5 areas you see are the key top 5 areas of AI adoption in BFSI sector, and how has it helped impact consumers and accelerate your business? What are the key factors enabling this? If you could throw some lights on the risks and challenges as well.
Thank you. Thank you, Sindhu. It is a good afternoon in India here. And so thank you, the audience, for listening to us. So yeah, you talked about, banks picking up AI, ingesting very quickly. Yes, we use that as a competitive advantage. All over the world, we're seeing this happening in the banking financial sector. You asked about where we are using it most. I mean, we're using it in many, many ways, but the few that I think are most important. So one of the top ones is use of virtual digital assistants and chatbots, right? So, well, you call the bank, human agents used to answer. Now it's mostly the bot. So the conversational AI is very much in use these days. And it goes on to also, help you do things like, even open an account for you. It would do your customer identification, validations, everything. So that way, I think the time of the customer as well as the, the efficiencies of the bank, are optimized. So that's one thing. The other important areas are, say, fraud detection, right? So when, like you said, pandemic. In the pandemic, most people have moved on to online digital kind of banking, and frauds have also increased. So any suspicious activity, I mean, AI is able to capture that very quickly and warn us and even stop the transaction from happening in most cases. So even money laundering and fraud, that also it's able to see which transaction look scary. Things like banking applications themselves, right? Those also AI-driven ones are where we are able to see, target it to like a hyper personalization level, where we are able to see that this person has these kind of life goals and uses, whatever, this social media, uses this kind of shopping, does this holiday or whatever. We are able to kind of understand the customer better and target a banking application or a product towards that customer. The other area I think that comes to mind is loan disbursement. So using AI, predictive AI, we are also able to see the repayment capability. So if my AI is telling me that this kind of a profile may not be that suitable, obviously credit decisioning becomes easier. So these are the kinds of things. I mean, back end, of course, the bank is using AI for its own use, yeah, for operational efficiencies and productivity increases and stuff. Finally, all of that converts to user, the customer's benefit. So these are the kinds of top areas I would think that we are using AI. Yeah, it doesn't answer your question.
Sure. So, how do you think? What are the key risks or challenges which you foresee with increased adoption of AI? Maybe you might want to also touch upon that, Jayashree.
Yeah, thank you. So, it's like the movie, right? Spider-Man. What did they say? With great power comes great responsibility. And I actually believe that about AI. And in the context of AI, it's more and more visible because this is a power tool in our hands, right? And it's the varying uses from healthcare to industry 4.0 or even defense, right? Countries are using it for geopolitical strategic advantage. And if you have this tool properly harnessed, right, it will give us that power. So and like I said, it comes with responsibility. The other thing is we also have to note the difference between error in judgment versus error in intent. So sometimes our AI, when we build algorithms, and probably we'll touch upon that later also, is biased, is unexplainable. A lot of things happen, and but then we have to be conscious, right? Because error in judgment is still okay, but error in intent will destroy us. So I do believe that we have to be careful about how we use it. It's like a child that we train and use it to advantage, right?
Sure. Yeah. Thanks, Jayashree. Related to this, I'll move on to our next panelist, Shivani. Shivani, as you are aware, Jayashree touched upon that increased usage of and adoption of AI comes with its own risks and challenges. And as you are aware, governments have already started looking into the regulatory framework for AI, and various international principles of AI governance are also being established. They have kind of not really given any hard law, but they have started putting together working groups which talk about how do we bring in fairness in the AI usage, ethics, transparency, how do we, and various other aspects which are being talked about as well, right? So how are these regulatory guidelines and principles being adopted by the BFSI industry? What are the key imperatives due to these regulations, and what are the steps you are taking, as Jayashree said, to towards responsible AI?
Hi. So, first of all, as you rightly pointed out, there is nothing that has come in as a hard guideline as of now. Okay. So I think, when it comes to AI, there are 2-3 key themes that I would like to, really highlight, right? One is basically, as you guys rightly talked about, fairness, which is there, which is something that, constantly gets evaluated, looked at internally, and models keep getting recalibrated to ensure this, right? Uh, and of course, this is looked at both from a business lens as well as from a general fairness perspective, from the perspective of a customer or overall, right? So that's one aspect of it. The second is transparency. Now, transparency has another, sort of, you can say, another side to it, that is explainability. Because in a sense, if you have a black box an approach versus an explainable approach, I think not only does it help in the, overall, from a regulatory standpoint also it's important, but today I think that is very much expected from a business adoption standpoint. Okay, because if we don't have explainable AI, then it's quite impossible to really expand the adoption of AI, because it will lead to, business not being able to understand or comprehend or, being able to evaluate whether a model, is actually making sense or not. So I think transparency is kind of the need of the hour even today. I think that's one of the principles that's currently very, on top of our minds. And I think, as part of that, explainability comes in. So the kind of algorithms being chosen, the kind of, approaches to dimensionality reduction being chosen, the kind of, approach being taken to even building the model, everything is getting driven by this whole transparency, explainability. And also one of the reasons why I think most organizations are also now trying to develop their own teams and build their own models, because then, you're not really using a black box, but you know exactly what you're, building and why you're building what you're building. So that's the whole transparency, explainability principle. The third aspect of it is, I think, more, you can say, clarity in terms of the whole, how the AI life cycle is being managed, right? So, which is where, there is a lot of narrative today around ML ops. A few years back, I think we talked a lot about algorithms, and then maybe we talked about data, big data, right? But off late, there is a, slow and steady trickle and narrative around ML ops, which is basically what happens after we build the model, right? It's not just about, building a model and going live with it. So it's about, how are you ensuring that the model stays current with the data? How do we ensure that the model stays current with changing business realities, changing environmental factors? I mean, COVID that we've all lived through over the last 1 year has been a classic example. Very few models that were built before COVID would actually hold true as they are even after. So I think, I think these three principles of fairness, transparency / explainability, and you can say the whole life cycle management of AI are becoming center stage, and we are all looking into each of these aspects in different ways and ensuring that they are taken care of as we build and scale AI.
Thanks, Shivani, for bringing those important points. Do you want to give a few examples, say how
Sure.
you have taken care
Sure.
of these in building some of the solutions?
Sure. So I think, I think little bit on the explainability side, as I said, sometimes we are choosing, we are clearly choosing to, build a model with multiple algorithms. And then sometimes we're choosing to go with an algorithm that gives explainability over, results. If the, impact on results is not so significant, we are actually giving preference to explainability sometimes, especially when we're starting something new, right? So that's one way that we're doing it. So the choice of algorithm. Second is, the whole way we are constructing and deploying AI teams, right? it's becoming very, product centric, use case centric. This has been there for some time, but I think it's becoming deeper and, sharper because, it's all about delivering business outcomes. So therefore, being closely aware of the data, of the product, of the business realities, of the ecosystem. I think what has changed over here is our ecosystem is changing very rapidly. Earlier, you could build a model, maybe, it could be in steady state for, what could be months has now become days. What has become days has now, kind of become even shorter, maybe as a duration. So I think embedding yourself with the reality of the business and working very closely is another strategy that we have applied from the whole, explainability and transparency perspective. And from the whole fairness perspective, as I said, constant evaluation of results by a panel. So this panel would constitute a mix of, data science team members, the business team members, who would all be looking closely at the results, reviewing them. And then, there could be other cross-functional relevant teams also coming in, maybe, for example, risk or data and so on. And then everything together is looked at, and then, a decision is taken on fairness and so on. So the evaluation of the results by a larger, team of people is what is helping over here. And on the, streamlining of the AI journey, as I said, we are quite focused on MLOps, right? Because simply scaling AI beyond a point becomes inefficient if we don't have MLOps, as well built up. And we see ML and MLOps going hand in hand, right? I think one goes with the other. So when you build a model, you also think about operationalizing it, moving it into production, the workloads associated with moving it into production, how often the model needs to be retrained, what will trigger a retrain, constantly monitoring the performance and operationalizing the model in a way that is ready to do that is how we are looking at the whole life cycle management. So these are some of the initiatives that we have taken.
Thank you, Shivani. So moving forward to Rajesh. Rajesh, as Shivani highlighted, right? So there is a data and AI governance which is being put in place. What are the key aspects of the banking systems, the infrastructure, and the processes that need to adapt to the usage of AI and the regulations around AI? Are banks ready for this? What are your views on that?
Sure. No, thanks, Sindhu, and good afternoon, all. Now, I know Jayashree and Shivani have already spoken, but I'll just briefly brush that. As we see, AI continues to enable, improve, and automate, a lot of tasks and processes across different industry. And it is not only shifting how banks conduct business, but it is also, curating our daily experiences as consumers, right? And shaping how individuals interact with our world, right? Banks or different financial institutions, as they invest in AI solutions, they must understand there's a bias component and how it can affect the entire industry, the customers, and the brand. Now, Shivani also mentioned, right? Banks would need to set up ecosystems, right? Along with that, establish ethical frameworks, right? Accountability systems. And it is not only about artificial intelligence, collaborate with the combined collective intelligence with artificial intelligence and with the entire package, then have what infrastructure and systems need to be in place, right? While the need for data and ethics is definitely becoming widely acknowledged, a growing number of systems around the world have been establishing those practices, right? And the key element is anticipatory regulation. The key is whatever you do it from a past standpoint, you need to anticipate what's coming in future. Could be based on the general flow across the multinational companies, right? What is happening in Europe to what is happening in China to US. I'm sure many of the nations are also changing their internal regulation, right? Based on that, companies who operate out of this environment need to have anticipatory regulation, which we call, which means not a fixed set of development rules, but iterative processes where we'll have test beds, sandboxes, right? Allowing live testing of innovations, new products and services in a highly controlled environment. Now, this could not be done by the banks alone. It could be a multidisciplinary regulation, right? Where we can include startups, think tanks, academia, again, companies, even governments, and those commissions to come up with what infrastructure, should contain. Now, again, regulation is still catching up to this, area, and there's no standard approach. But eventually, the use of AI means it's trustworthy, transparent, and explainable, to the explainability thing which Shivani, spoke, right? Now, deploying capabilities, definitely require a more scalable, resilient, and core technology component there, where if we are starved of investments in these arenas, then it can dramatically reduce the effectiveness of how the decision making across these engagement layers will happen. Now, I'll talk about 3 or 4 key elements what banks need to have. One is you can say tech forward strategy, which means the technology and the businesses cannot be mutually exclusive, right? Everyone will have their own goals throughout the year, but how this comes as a unified technology strategy, which is tightly linked to the business strategy and outlines the different strategic choices, right? What kind of elements we need, the skill set of an organization, the talent that bank will really like to keep in-house, and then source through different partnerships. You can't, have it all. There is also a component of data management, right? Now, banks' data management must ensure, what we call data liquidity, right? The ability to access, ingest, and then manipulate that data that serve as a foundation for all the insights and decisions. Eventually, the different data analytics and insight generation will happen from the enablement that is already there, and the decisions that are generated from that layer definitely increases the removal of, I would say, silos or multiple divisions to how they can operate with the same data with more coordination, right? Then, I can go one level technical. There are modern APIs. Our architecture needs to ensure that those, services and products are there, and how we can increase reusability of technology assets, right? And promote flexibility. That's the key, where APIs can really unlock that significant value on how to start defining, those centralized governance practices. And then finally, it is about, I would say, intelligent infrastructure, right? How cloud could be brought in, how the work load can be handled on public and private infrastructure. And finally, these cost and self-servicing model need to be there, where that enable our innovation cycles, right? So in a nutshell, these elements will really ensure that banks strategy from a data governance and how they need to move forward. Now, to answer another question, are the banks ready? Now, again, it's a complex question to ask. In some of the cases, they are reactive in nature based on the regulations they are put. There can also be the scale of the bank might not be that big to really implement all those. Then they might ride on some of the services provided by their partners. But then eventually, everyone understands the importance of this governance, and it is not only about enhancing their infrastructure, but also ensuring that the way we manage the data and how the fairness component which we spoke, it really works along with that in coming years. That's how I will answer, Sindhu.
Sure. So just to kind of cover one aspect of it is in terms of the risks and the liability. Say, for example, there have been, I think, few cases, if I can talk about, where data privacy, data ownership, like there are a lot of FCRA and various other regulations are there, as well as like US government talks about federal algorithmic auditing. And there have been some cases, litigations, where we have talked about customers asking for financial institutions, algorithms making a wrong decision, and the banks are liable for that, right? So Shivani touched upon this in terms of making sure that there is a explainability for the decisions. But do you want to cover some aspects of this as well in terms of the technology and the processes, in terms of addressing the risks and liabilities?
Sure. So, one thing is, and, we need to probably see it in a very simple manner. Now, it's customers' data, right? They own it. They even should know how much consent they have, to share it, right? And it's company's responsibility to protect it. through the platforms or the systems they put. So, while we'll talk about all the complexity around the governance, how the government's regulations are becoming stricter, nationalism is increasing, every company is or every country is ensuring that the data stays within all that. What is the basic need? I think if we really go back, it's about protecting consumers or customers' privacy. Having said that, if we share upfront that by leveraging customers data, you get these added benefits, probably the concerns will be fewer. I think the reality is the layman doesn't understand a lot of in-depth of how these things are managed. It's like there's a data breach, for example, right now. What does it mean? They'll probably don't know. It's like it's a panic button, like as if every breach means that their entire saving bank account will be empty. I think somewhere down the line that knowledge needs to be passed on to consumers, that yes, there is a storage of data that happens. There are, let's say, cookies where you are accepting your privacy, but eventually they can be beneficial to you if we leverage it in a right manner. I think if we provide that knowledge, I'm sure rest of that is the more like a causal analysis on how the countries are really putting some guidelines and how we need to ensure that our platforms are upgraded to ensure that we comply. I think compliance is one thing, but there's a larger awareness or knowledge that we should provide at ground level, so that eventually people see a win-win in this situation.
Sure, thanks. Moving on to Jayashree. Jayashree, while we have talked about adoption of AI, we are also seeing emergence of the fintech industry, where there are players, nimble players, who are leveraging technology to provide digital financial services. And the pandemic, you see a lot more which people have started launching and using. Like you have even seen fintech companies giving Bitcoin-based trading services, right? So how do you think the regulations around AI will affect your competitive strategy against these fintech players? And what are your views, and how are you planning to rapidly adopt these technologies while addressing the competition in mind?
Okay. Now, as Rajesh said, complex question. All right. So I think the nothing changes whether you're a fintech or an established bank, right? Because if you're dealing with people's money, you're dealing with people's data, the rules are the same. Now, having said that, if you look at the way, I think Shivani touched on it, or maybe you did, said that, there aren't really very strong regulations and frameworks as of now. It's emerging. I mean, everybody's emerging in this field. So mostly it is guideline based or advice based, right? So just coming to your fintech talk, number one, nothing changes. We will, I'm sure most banks will try to partner with fintechs, especially those who comply with existing regulations, or in this area where there aren't any stringent ones, the ones who are most self-regulated, right? And in self-regulation, I mean all the principles that Shivani was mentioning, things like principle of safety, reliability, accountability, data privacy, non-discrimination, I would think transparency, and above all, I would think the principle of protection of positive human values, right? So we know that it is not against a societal impact, like an adverse societal impact, and of the examples. I mean, we as human beings are probably allowed a little more bias than an artificial intelligent creature will be allowed to. So it is, it is imperative that we, are careful with all this. And, to just answer your question, nothing changes with fintech. And that fintech better live up to all these standards for anybody to either partner with it or buy it out, or even Shivani was saying, like, we started creating our own teams so that we can look at transparency, provability, very important, and again accountability ending at a human level. You can't say this bot is accountable. You just can't say that. It's a human being behind it. And most countries, if you see, are rooting for accountability at the board level, even for AI. So I would think that that these are signs of times to come, and ethical AI, very important. Things like data with consent. And like Rajesh was saying, people don't understand why the data is being used, and maybe they believe that just a data breach has taken away everything. So again, there also explainability is important. That this is what I will do with your data, and this is it. I will not do more. So that kind of building trust, and banks are establishments which run on trust only. So very important that we use this AI power very responsibly.
Sure, Jayashree. Moving on to Shivani. So Shivani, you did touch upon the end-to-end data and AI governance, life cycle, etc. Right? So, but there is a lot of inherent data which already exists within the banking ecosystem, and this data itself may not be without bias, right? So you will probably find a lot of data. Maybe you don't have much data in some cases, or maybe you have a lot of data, but there is a lot of data which has been gathered by humans themselves, and inherent biases do exist. How do you, data is the fuel for AI. So whatever we give to AI, it will probably give the right decision. So how are you making sure that the data itself is right, and how are you looking at the data angle in terms of ensuring like responsible AI, or ensuring regulatory frameworks around AI as addressed?
Sure. So, I mean, I think, see, when we, I think that's a very, good question from a, direction to think perspective. I think there are a couple of things that we are doing. I think one is that, first is not collecting the data right, as you rightly said, right? So that's one aspect. So here, we are looking at, the data design correctly. Okay, what kind of data is being collected? Constantly, there are new sources of data available. Okay, constantly, there are, sort of new ways of collecting data that are available. Maybe not involve humans in collecting data. Okay, that's where can we use systems? Can we use proxies? Can we use customer behavior? Which is implicitly expressed through many triggers, through the digital footprint. Can that be used? So that's one is using, as I said, data that is something that we are leaving in various places as our footprint, or using data that, or designing data more collection more carefully when we are actually going out and saying, okay, I am collecting data for this, right? So that's one way to de-bias the data, right? The second is that there is a lot of bias in using the data that we have collected. Okay, so there is mentally a tendency to discard some data, or discard some features, right? So I think, again, this is also getting revisited, and this is where probably fintechs and challenger companies are playing a role, right? As the banking system is getting exposed to new business strategies, or new segments that are looking interesting, right? Then you can't really afford to ignore some of the data that maybe you have and you were not looking at earlier, because somebody else seems to be making a business model out of just leveraging that data. So I think the way the business models themselves are evolving, the way lending is evolving, for example, or the way customer payments is evolving, for example, or the way the whole customer's financial behavior is evolving, right? So it's becoming very evident that data that you might have earlier had a blind spot to also has to be looked at. Right? So that's the second way in which you can say banking models are getting de-biased, right? Also, certain customer segments that might have been not looked at earlier also have to be looked at, because that is where probably the next billion is, or the next billion is, and so on. So I think business opportunities themselves are driving this, right? And change in customer behavior is driving this. So that is de-biasing the way data is used or looked at. The third is, de-biasing, the way, models are built or models are consumed, etc. So here again, business itself is playing a role, right? Because you want to basically chase certain opportunities that might have, not been possible earlier, or not been available earlier, or been out of bounds earlier, have suddenly come inside bounds. Okay, maybe there is a partnership way to do it. Maybe there is a direct way to do it, right? Or maybe there is a, digital way to do it. But in some way, maybe the, regulatory framework and maybe the, current ecosystem is permitting to do it. So again, I think, that's also leading us to look at things in a new light, and definitely, opening up new doors. So to summarize, I would say that, there is a certain ethical consciousness, of course, that's driving things, but there is also a certain business and customer behavior that is driving this whole, journey ahead.
Sure, thanks, Shivani. So another aspect which is very important of the data itself is the cybersecurity related challenges. What we have, you have all the data in one place, and then you have to also make sure that the data is secure, right? So do you want to touch upon the cybersecurity as well with respect to the data briefly?
Yeah. So I think cybersecurity, how, most organizations we are looking at it is, I think, one, keeping ourselves completely updated with the kind of developments in this space, right? This, directly through, experiences that are happening globally, the kind of, threats that have been seen, that have been experienced globally. Also, we are keeping ourselves abreast, through conversations with, our whole ecosystem partners, etc. And also, obviously, then bringing this into implementation. Okay. However, I think, as banks, we are regulated. So obviously, there are certain, principles that we are following, and those are definitely, de-risking us to a large extent, in terms of the way we store our data, in terms of the way we use the cloud. So there are already certain principles and frameworks in place. But I think what we're trying to do over the last few years is sort of balance the two, right? That, ensure data security, at the same time ensure that we're also able to leverage the latest that technology has to offer. Because I think, as was said earlier as well, scalability is important, and here cloud becomes important. So how do we sort of, balance it out? Another aspect, when we look at it from a cyber threat perspective, is also customer education. Right? So I think this is also an area where the regulator is also very actively now playing a role. I think all of us have seen various advertisements and various, informations and so on in this topic. And I think each one of the banks are also actively doing this in partnership with the regulator, right? So I think that is also something that's critical. The third area is on the whole, preemptive tracking, or very, very early tracking that we're all doing, right? In terms of, sharpening, the kind of fraud rules that we have, in terms of ensuring that, the tracking is real time or near real time, wherever, there is a significant risk. And, immediately there is a, complete process and framework in place to, reach out the customer and ensure that, the entire process is quickly detected and mitigated. So I think these are all, different platforms that are working together to ensure that we manage this risk intelligently.
Okay, thanks, Shivani. Over to Rajesh. So Rajesh, what are the, I think we have kind of covered the gamut of how we have to look at AI and the regulatory framework around AI. So maybe I'll just ask a question as to what banks or fintech institutions or maybe BFSI should not be doing in the adoption of AI and looking at the kind of regulations around AI. That is the first question. Maybe to also give your vision in terms of how the AI adoption and the regulatory space will evolve in the next couple of years. And what do you see as the opportunities and the risks which banks and BFSI industry should proactively address?
Sure, Sindhu. Again, no, we do understand we are in a crunch of a time, top of the hour. So I'll try to be as crisp as possible. I think the key word for me is scale, right? I think banks should, move from experimentation around few use cases to actually have a lot of scalability in how they need to put AI technology. So if you ask me don'ts, I would say, rather than again taking today, we take this use case versus this use case is a very ad hoc in nature kind of a strategy versus, building scale, and which is 3 to 5 years, down the line. So rather than those, again, fragmented data assets, like we said before, those larger scalable activities is something that we need to do. Now, there are other things around, being more personalized when it, terms of targeting the customer, how we can have more relevance, the timeliness, and, have a detailed understanding of past behavior. I think that is one area banks can further improve. We talked about intelligence before, the anticipatory, thing that should be. Then finally, it should be an omni-channel presence. So across physical, online context, multiple devices. I think one thing we need to ensure is that, it cannot be only a, siloed one channel approach for any of our customers if we really need to stay relevant in future. Now, opportunities again are huge. We definitely understand from a technology standpoint whether these are smart agents or neural network or different case-based reasoning that we have. Jayashree spoke about the fraud, right, portion of how it is detected and prevented. I think the key is these disruptive AI technologies can improve banks' ability to achieve higher profits or personalization or omni-channel that we spoke about, and that should be the core of their strategy. If we talk about risk, there cannot be any innovation without risk, and many of them have become mainstream conversations. Most of the boardrooms, even classrooms, and the offices of regulators, they are worried about how it can be misused. Now, these, as we say, the socio-economic bias, right, at the outcome of AI solutions can definitely bring in a lot of cases. If you talk about the current trends and themes, customers' expectations are really rising, right? Whether it's digital banking, all those, and all the banks need to ensure that, they have those digital ecosystems that are, again, moving those traditional financial services to, really up the game there. And again, while the technology giants are entering financial services now, I think they are building those core business models to really play in that area. The thought I want to leave you is, we, from a risk standpoint, we need to understand what biases that we have, right? It can include rules, machine learning models, or some of the prejudiced decisions, right? That can disproportionately impact a lot of decisions. It could unfairly, let's say, from a bank standpoint, unfairly decline the bank account applications, block payments, credit cards, deny loan. I think, some of those biases need to be removed, right? Sometimes we also think that the sensitive information should be completely hidden. That's a don't, right? I think we cannot withhold information. Again, we understand that, if we hide sensitive information, that it could have been fair outcomes. Not necessarily. I think deliberately not collecting sensitive information is also not the right thing. I think the problem of bias runs much deeper, right, and requires all layers. There has to be, again, continuous monitoring. If we don't measure and prevent bias, it will really create reputational risk for many of the companies. And finally, like we spoke about the scale component, how to build that ethical AI system. So, some of these trends based on humans' behavior and the outcomes that our infrastructure needs to have, they need to work hand in hand so that the banks are better prepared to ensure that we give more comfort to our larger customers. I think that's where the key element would be. I would say, whether you say 2 years down the line, in summary, the whatever benefits that we have of AI, far outweigh the risks, but it needs to be managed in a manner that we promote trustworthiness and human-centeredness, right, and protect our individuals from any harm, right, to really create a positive impact on our society, augmenting their decision making to help a more fair, inclusive, and decent world. This is where I'll summarize.
That was a great summary, Rajesh. So I'll probably check with the MC and the Rajat here. Are there any questions from the audience?
Hi, Sindhu. No questions as yet.
Okay. So I think we will probably wait if there are any further questions. Like I would probably then look at summarizing some of the key points which we discussed today, and Rajesh has already done a fabulous job of bringing in what the benefits versus risks are there. Okay, and but I will try and at least highlight a few things which I noted and maybe and conclude this discussion. So as we all discussed, banking, BFSI industry is on the cusp of huge innovation, leveraging AI. And this is something which is enabled by the huge demand from the customer itself, like in terms of the customer expectations, and also several regulatory factors which enable, like say, for example, anti-money laundering or fraud detection, etc. And the panel here concur to the view is that AI certainly brings a lot of opportunities, and then AI is certainly the way to go. AI and data-enabled digital banking services is the way to go. And there are so many different areas in which AI can make a significant impact. But the panel here also emphasized on the fact that all of these AI systems will have to be currently self-regulated. We have to keep the safety of the customer in mind, the principle of protection of human values, as Jayashree highlighted, the provability and usage of data with consent. And we have the data and the AI governance part of it, where we have to bring in the fairness and the transparency and the explainability. Some of the approaches being taken here is one is in terms of making sure there is a robust AI and data lifecycle management. There are basically business-centric AI deployments where there is a larger set of people looking into the AI systems and evaluating them, and there is a governance mechanism in place to approve all of these AI solutions. And some of the other aspects which banking and BFSI customers are addressing is in terms of getting in the right skill sets for enabling some of these requirements, making all of these systems more business centric, and keeping the customer in the core of all of these experience being designed, and bringing the collective intelligence of the entire business plus IT team. The anticipatory regulatory approach to minimize risks and liability is something which came out as a very key aspect of what needs to be addressed. And last but not the least, the technology components, which probably add to the fuel in terms of the proper data designs, making sure that the data itself is debiased by reducing the human element there, which Shivani highlighted, right? and bringing in data liquidity, modern APIs, centralized governance, and cloud-enabled technologies to drive these innovations, right? So I think all of us here probably look at more in terms of AI should certainly bring in a lot of opportunities for this sector. At the same time, a proactive approach and self-regulation is the way to go. And I see a lot of initiatives already being taken by the industry in this regard. If there are no further audience questions, probably we can conclude this panel discussion.
Thank you. Thanks, Sindhu.
Thanks a lot for all the panelists.